The room was buzzing with excitement, a mix of laughter, chatter, and the faint clinking of glasses. The annual charity event had drawn quite a crowd that evening. People in their best clothes walked around, exchanging greetings and smiling at friends they hadn't seen in months. The soft glow of chandeliers reflected off polished floors, and the scent of flowers from the corners of the hall filled the air. Everything looked perfect, almost like a scene from a magazine. And everyone seemed to be in high spirits. At the center of all this was the grand piano, standing proudly on the stage, its polished black surface gleaming under the spotlights. It wasn't just any piano, it was one of the finest instruments in the city, capable of producing sounds so rich and powerful that it could make anyone feel the music deep in their chest. Tonight, the piano was meant to be the star, but no one expected just how important it would become. People had gathered to watch a few performances by well-known musicians, and among them was a man who drew attention even before he had played a single note. He was a celebrated pianist, famous not only for his talent but also for his confidence, some would call it arrogance. He had an air about him that made people notice him immediately. Even from across the room you could see the way he carried himself, shoulders back, chin high, and a faint smirk playing on his lips. People whispered about his skill, but also about his reputation for looking down on anyone he thought was lesser. Meanwhile, at the edge of the room, a quiet woman stood, watching from a distance. She wasn't dressed in a fancy gown, nor did she try to catch anyone's attention. Her clothes were simple, her hair pulled back, and she carried herself with a humble, almost shy, posture. She had come to the event because she cared about the cause, not because she wanted to be seen. She watched the crowd, listening to the chatter and laughter, feeling a little out of place but still curious. When the organizers announced that anyone who wanted could try playing the piano, a small ripple of excitement ran through the audience. Some people laughed at the idea, thinking it would be fun to see a few amateurs fumble on the keys. The famous pianist, seated nearby, let out a small, mocking chuckle. His eyes scanned the crowd, landing on the quiet woman standing in the corner. "She shouldn't even touch it," he whispered to someone beside him, his tone filled with amusement. "People like her have no business on a stage like this." The words stung, though he likely didn't mean them to travel beyond the immediate area. The woman heard them anyway. She looked down, feeling her cheeks warm. She wasn't sure if she should step forward. Her heart raced, and for a moment she considered turning and leaving, just blending back into the crowd. But then something inside her stirred. Despite the embarrassment, despite the mocking tone, she felt a small, quiet determination. She had once learned to play the piano, years ago, when she had more time and fewer responsibilities. She had studied diligently, practicing for hours each day. Life had pulled her in other directions, and her piano dreams had been set aside, but the music had never left her. Now, standing there, hearing the doubt in the famous pianist's voice, she felt a spark. Maybe it was courage, maybe it was defiance, or maybe it was simply the desire to prove to herself that she still could, the host of the event. Noticing her hesitation, stepped forward with a kind smile. "Would you like to play?" he asked gently. "Even just one piece if you like. We'd love to hear you." Her hands tightened on the sides of her dress. She nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, and walked toward the stage. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the floor beneath her were moving in slow motion. The crowd's attention shifted to her, though many were unsure what to expect. Some whispered to each other, curious but polite. Others, noticing the famous pianist's smug expression, braced themselves for an awkward moment. When she reached the piano, she paused, taking a deep breath. Her fingers hovered over the keys, remembering the feel of them under her fingertips, the way the smooth surface would respond to even the slightest touch. Her heart thumped loudly in her chest, but it wasn't fear alone, it was anticipation, a mix of nerves and excitement. From his seat, the pianist leaned back, crossing his arms and raising one eyebrow. He whispered just loud enough for a few people nearby to hear, "She's going to ruin it. I'll enjoy watching this." The words weren't meant for her, but she heard them clearly. For a brief moment she felt the familiar sting of shame, the embarrassment of being underestimated. But instead of shrinking away, she closed her eyes for a second and let herself remember something important. The music wasn't about proving anyone else wrong. It had never been about that. It was about the joy it brought, the feelings it could awaken, and the stories it could tell without words. She opened her eyes and looked at the piano. The black and white keys seemed to glimmer in the soft light, and she smiled faintly. This was her chance, however small, to reconnect with something she had loved. And even if no one else understood it, even if the arrogant pianist scoffed at her, she knew that the music would speak for her. The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. Some were intrigued, some were skeptical, but everyone was watching now. The famous pianist leaned forward slightly, curiosity mingling with his arrogance. He was confident, of course. But even he had to admit he was curious to see what she could do. Then she placed her fingers lightly on the keys. The first note rang out softly, almost like a whisper, delicate but clear. It wasn't loud, it wasn't showy, but it was precise. The room went quiet. Even the clinking of glasses seemed to fade. All eyes were on her. She played another note, then another, letting her hands find the rhythm naturally. She didn't rush, she didn't hesitate, and each sound she produced carried a quiet beauty that caught the audience by surprise. There was something in her playing, something that wasn't just skill, it was feeling. It was the years she had poured into music, the lessons learned, the struggles endured. Even though she was simple in appearance, every note she played had a depth that few could reach. The famous pianist watched in silence, his expression slowly changing. The smirk faded, replaced by curiosity and then by something else, something he wasn't used to feeling. He leaned forward, studying her hands, listening to the music. For a man who had spent decades perfecting his own performances, he was experiencing something unexpected. Admiration. The audience, too, was captivated. People who had been skeptical now leaned in, unable to look away. Whispers turned to murmurs of amazement. Some shook their heads in disbelief, unsure how someone so unassuming could produce such beautiful sound. The quiet woman on the stage, who had seemed so ordinary, was filling the room with music that touched hearts without needing words. As the final note lingered in the air, it was as if time had stopped for a moment. The room held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The sound faded, but the feeling remained soft, profound. Unforgettable. For the first time that evening, there was no laughter, no mocking, no whispers of doubt, only silence. And in that silence, the quiet woman stood tall. Not because she wanted recognition, but because she had shared a part of herself with the world, and it had been heard, and somewhere in the room. The famous pianist realized that the night was not about him, about his skill, or about proving he was the best. It was about the music, and for the first time, someone else had reminded him of its true power. After the first note faded, the room remained silent for a moment longer than usual, as if everyone were holding their breath. The quiet woman stood at the piano, her hands still hovering over the keys. Her heart was racing, not from fear, but from something more profound, a feeling that had been buried for years, now suddenly alive again. Music had always been her refuge, a place where the world's judgments did not matter. Tonight, however, that refuge was exposed under the bright lights and the watchful eyes of strangers. As she looked around, she noticed the famous pianist watching her intently. The arrogance she had sensed before was still there, but it seemed tempered now by curiosity. His eyebrows were slightly raised, and there was a hint of tension around his mouth. He had seen countless performers, some trained at the finest conservatories, others who had traveled the world playing on grand stages. Yet something about her presence and the way she handled the piano had caught him off guard. He couldn't figure out why. The woman closed her eyes for a second, allowing herself to sink into the memory of her lessons long ago. She had studied for years under a strict teacher who demanded perfection in every note, every finger movement. At the time, it had felt like punishment, an endless series of drills and corrections. But she had loved it. She had loved the way music could tell stories without words, how a single melody could carry emotions too complex for ordinary conversation. Life had moved on, responsibilities had grown, and piano had become a memory, tucked away like a precious object she couldn't afford to lose. Now, Years later, she felt that old passion stirring again. Her fingers moved naturally over the keys, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. The first notes were simple, almost shy, but as she continued, they began to form patterns that were both familiar and new. She played from memory, but also from feeling, letting the music guide her instead of thinking about every technical detail. It was as though the piano and she were reconnecting after a long separation, rediscovering the bond that had once been so strong. The audience watched in quiet amazement. Some had expected a clumsy performance, a few awkward notes at best, but they were completely wrong. There was something in the way her hands moved, the way her body leaned slightly into the music that made it impossible to look away. It was not just skill, it was emotion, honesty, and the kind of authenticity that can only come from someone who has lived a life full of experiences. Joys and disappointments. The famous pianist shifted in his seat. He had seen many performers, as noted, but rarely had he seen someone play with such unpolished, raw emotion. Professionals often relied on technique, on perfection, on reputation. She had none of that, and yet she commanded attention effortlessly. It was a shock to him, and he realized that he had underestimated her completely. For the first time, he felt a mix of doubt and respect, a strange combination that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. She moved into a more complex part of the piece, a section that demanded both precision and expression. Her fingers danced across the keys, sometimes softly, sometimes with force, pulling the music from the piano in waves of sound. Each note seemed deliberate, yet effortless. The melody rose and fell like a conversation, telling a story that words could never capture. Some people in the audience felt tears prick at their eyes, moved by the emotion that seemed to radiate from her very being. In that moment, the room became more than a hall for a charity event. It became a place of shared experience, where strangers were bound together by the beauty of music. The clinking of glasses, the low chatter, even the distant hum of traffic outside seemed to disappear. There was only the piano, her, and the sound she created. She had forgotten, for a brief moment, about the mocking voice that had greeted her earlier. The words that had stung so sharply now felt distant, powerless against the music flowing from her hands. Yet she couldn't ignore them completely. They had given her a kind of fuel, a subtle push that reminded her why she wanted to play. Not to show off, not to prove anyone wrong, but simply to express what she carried inside. The audience leaned forward in their seats, captivated by the unexpected depth of her performance. Some exchanged whispered remarks, voices tinged with surprise. Where did she learn to play like that? One person murmured, I never expected. Another said, trailing off, unable to find the words. Even the famous pianist could not hide his astonishment. He had built a career on mastery, on technical brilliance, and yet here was someone who seemed to bypass all of that, speaking directly to the hearts of everyone in the room. He felt a pang of humility, a sensation he was not accustomed to experiencing. He had always believed that skill and training alone defined a musician's worth, but now he saw something different, something far more powerful than technique, authenticity. The woman's performance began to take on a narrative, as though she were telling a story without ever opening her mouth. Her past, her struggles, the quiet moments of joy and sorrow, all were conveyed in the music. She was no longer a simple observer or a hesitant participant. She was the storyteller, and the piano was her voice. Each rise and fall of the melody drew listeners deeper, compelling them to feel alongside her. Some of the audience members could not help themselves. They closed their eyes to focus entirely on the sound. Some whispered quietly to their neighbors, sharing their astonishment. Others simply sat in silence, overwhelmed by the unexpected depth of the performance. Even the staff members serving food and drinks paused in their duties, unable to ignore the spell being cast. The famous pianist remained seated, his arms no longer crossed, his posture slightly forward. He watched, analyzing without judging, trying to understand how someone so ordinary in appearance could convey such extraordinary emotion. He noticed the subtle shifts in her expression, the slight movements of her shoulders, the gentle sway of her head. It all worked together with the music, creating a harmony that went far beyond notes on a page. She played for several more minutes, each section of the piece more captivating than the last. The melody was now soaring, rising to moments of intensity that made hearts race. She had forgotten everything else, the crowd, the lights, even the famous pianist. There was only her and the piano, connected in a way that felt sacred, private, yet shared with everyone around her. Finally, she approached the last part of the piece, a soft, lingering conclusion that felt almost like a sigh. Her fingers moved delicately, producing a series of notes that seemed to echo long after they had been struck. The final chord hung in the air, resonant and complete, and the room stayed silent for a heartbeat longer, as if no one wanted to break the magic. When she lifted her hands from the keys, the silence broke, not immediately, but gradually. Then came the applause, a wave that started small, tentative, and then grew, swelling with genuine appreciation. People clapped, some standing to give her a standing ovation, others simply wiping tears from their eyes. The sound of admiration filled the hall, not for show, but because her performance had touched them deeply. The famous pianist finally stood, slowly, deliberately, moving closer to the stage. His eyes, which had once held amusement and doubt, now reflected a mixture of awe and humility. He realized that he had been wrong to judge her based on appearance or circumstances. In that moment, he understood that true talent was not always loud or boastful. It could be quiet, understated, and yet move mountains in the hearts of those who listened. She looked at him briefly, not with anger, but with calm recognition. She had felt his judgment before, but now it no longer mattered. She had played not for him, not for validation, but for the music itself, and in doing so, had reminded everyone, including him, of what truly matters when one creates art. The room slowly returned to normal, the chatter and clinking of glasses resuming, but something had changed. People whispered about the performance, about the quiet woman who had surprised them all. They spoke of the emotion, the skill, and the courage it took to step forward despite fear and doubt. And the famous pianist? He remained near the stage, silent, reflecting on a lesson that had come unexpectedly, but one he would not forget. The moment felt suspended in time. The audience, still reeling from the unexpected beauty of her earlier notes, leaned in closer, almost holding their breath, waiting to see what would come next. The quiet woman's fingers hovered over the keys for a brief second, and then, as if sensing the emotions in the room, she began to play again. But this time, her music carried something different, something deeper, more urgent, and completely mesmerizing. Each note seemed to tell a story, not just a melody, but a narrative that flowed directly from her heart. She played with such focus that it was impossible to imagine anything else existing in that moment. The lights in the room softened around her, the glimmer of the chandeliers reflecting faintly off the polished piano, and somehow it all made the music feel alive, almost tangible. People could feel the emotion in every note, vibrating in the air, pressing gently against their hearts. The famous pianist, who had watched her with cautious interest before, now found himself completely captivated. He had never expected to feel this way while observing another performer. His usual critical eye, trained to analyze every minor imperfection, softened, replaced by awe. He could see the emotion in her hands, the subtle rise and fall of her fingers, the gentle shifts of her body as she poured herself into the piece. Each movement was a message, and each note was a word in a language only music could speak. Some in the audience closed their eyes to fully absorb the sound. Others watched, rapt, as if trying to memorize every gesture, every subtle expression. People who had arrived skeptical, curious only for entertainment, now sat completely still, caught in the current of something profoundly moving. The room was no longer just a hall for a charity event. It had become a vessel for emotion, a space where the human heart could be touched in ways that words could never achieve. She moved into a section of the piece that demanded more technical skill, yet she played it effortlessly. Her fingers danced over the keys, fast at times, gentle at others, never missing a beat. But it wasn't just her technique that held the audience's attention, it was the emotion embedded in each phrase. Every crescendo felt like a wave of hope, every soft passage a quiet whisper of longing. The music spoke of joy and sorrow, struggle and triumph, and everyone listening could feel it in their own way. The famous pianist leaned closer, unable to tear his eyes away. He had spent decades performing, practicing endlessly to masterpieces just like this one. Yet now he was watching someone ordinary by appearance, someone he had initially dismissed, command the room with a combination of skill, heart, and authenticity that even he found humbling. For a man whose pride had always been tied to his talent, it was a revelation. He realized that all his years of practice, all his accolades, had never quite captured this raw, moving essence that she exuded naturally. Her eyes remained partly closed, not in shyness but in concentration. She was entirely immersed in the music, allowing it to flow from her without interference from fear or expectation. And yet, she was aware of the audience, aware of the impact her playing had on them. She didn't play to impress. She played to express. But the effect was undeniable. The silence that had hung in the room earlier was now filled with something more powerful than words. An almost sacred reverence as she transitioned into the most emotional part of the piece. The room became completely still. Every listener felt the intensity of the music in their own way. Some felt memories rise to the surface, long-forgotten emotions surfacing unexpectedly. Others felt tears forming, unable to resist the pure emotional force of the melody. The music seemed to stretch beyond the piano itself, reaching into the hearts of everyone present, connecting them in a way that was both intimate and universal. The famous pianist's expression had changed completely. Gone was the arrogance, replaced by astonishment, admiration, and a touch of self-reflection. He found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about performance, talent, and what it truly means to move people with music. He had always believed that technique and reputation were the keys to greatness, but here she was, proving him wrong with every note. She had none of his fame, none of his polished stage experience. And yet she held more power over the room than he ever had. Her hands glided over the keys with precision and ease. Yet there was no pretense, no showiness. She did not play for applause or recognition. She played because she had something to say, and she had spent years learning how to let the music carry her thoughts and feelings. Each note seemed intentional but not forced. It was effortless, natural, and utterly captivating. People in the audience exchanged glances, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Some whispered softly, almost reverently, "How is this possible?" Others simply shook their heads in disbelief, feeling that no words could ever do justice to the experience. Even those who had come for a casual evening of entertainment were now completely absorbed. Their hearts touched in ways they hadn't anticipated. The intensity of the music grew. She reached the climax of the piece, where every note seemed to demand attention, where every chord carried weight and meaning. Her fingers moved faster now, yet nothing felt rushed or chaotic. There was a rhythm, a story unfolding, an emotional journey that she guided the audience through without ever speaking. The room was filled with a sound that seemed almost alive, resonating in the walls, the floor, and the very hearts of everyone present. The famous pianist, standing near the stage now, felt a wave of humility wash over him. He realized that pride and arrogance, no matter how justified by skill, could not compete with authenticity and heart. For the first time, he understood that music is not just about notes and technical mastery, it is about connection, about speaking to people on a level deeper than words, about revealing something of oneself that can touch the lives of others. Tears formed in the eyes of some audience members, quietly brushed away, but they didn't stop listening. The music was too powerful, too real, to interrupt, and the woman at the piano continued to pour herself into the performance, seemingly unaware of the effect she was having. It was as if the piano had become an extension of her being, a medium through which her emotions could flow freely into the hearts of others. The piece began to slow, moving into its final passage. Her fingers moved delicately now, softening the sound, letting each note linger in the air like a gentle memory. The crescendo had passed, and the room seemed to sigh collectively, the energy settling into a hushed, reflective silence. The audience knew the end was near, but they were not ready to let go of the spell she had cast. The final chord rang out, pure and resonant, and then faded into silence. It was a long, deliberate silence, the kind that leaves you holding your breath even after the sound is gone. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The effect of the music lingered, wrapping around the audience like a warm embrace. It was a moment none of them would ever forget. And then, slowly, the applause began. It started as small claps, tentative and hesitant, as if no one wanted to believe this was real. But the sound grew, louder and more genuine with each passing second, until the room was filled with the unmistakable roar of admiration. People stood, clapping and cheering, some wiping tears from their eyes, others smiling in awe. The music had done what words could not. It had touched the deepest part of every listener. The famous pianist stood as well, the applause washing over him, and finally, he took a hesitant step forward toward the stage. His eyes met hers, not with mockery, but with a mix of awe and respect. He had been completely wrong to judge her, wrong to assume that her simple appearance meant simple talent. Now he understood that true greatness is not always obvious, not always loud, and often comes from the most unexpected places. She looked at him briefly, a calm acknowledgment in her eyes. There was no gloating, no sense of triumph. She had not played to prove him wrong or to earn recognition. She had played because she had something to express, because music had always been a part of her, and tonight she had shared it with the world. And in doing so, she had not only touched the hearts of the audience, but also the heart of a man who had believed he understood music better than anyone else. The room slowly began to return to normal. But something had shifted. People whispered among themselves, sharing their astonishment and admiration. Some spoke of the depth of feeling in the performance, others of the courage it took to step forward, despite fear and doubt. And the famous pianist? He remained near the stage, silent, reflecting on a lesson that had come unexpectedly, but one he would never forget. The final note lingered in the air, vibrating softly, almost like a breath being held, and the room stayed silent for a moment longer than usual. It was as if time itself had paused to honor what had just happened. The quiet woman remained at the piano, her hands gently resting on the keys, her chest rising and falling as she drew in slow, steady breaths. Her eyes were open now, but instead of scanning the audience or seeking approval, she looked forward calmly, almost dreamlike. As if the music had transported her somewhere far beyond the hall, the audience remained frozen for several seconds, absorbing the sheer depth of what they had just witnessed. Some were still in shock, struggling to comprehend that a simple, unassuming woman had delivered such a performance. Others were moved to tears, their emotions stirred in ways they didn't anticipate. Every heart in the room had been touched, though in different ways, some by the skill, some by the emotion, and some simply by the courage it had taken to step forward when others doubted her. The famous pianist stood near the edge of the stage, still processing. He had always believed in technical mastery and years of training and recognition as the ultimate measure of talent. But now he realized how wrong he had been. Technique alone could not reach people's hearts the way her music had. She had poured herself into the piano in a way he had never seen, a way that made every note feel alive, every chord feel like a message from her soul. He felt a mix of humility and admiration, a strange sense of awe he had not thought possible. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he stepped forward. The audience noticed, murmuring quietly among themselves, sensing a shift. For the first time, the pianist's usual confidence seemed to falter. He approached the stage, eyes fixed on the woman at the piano, and for a moment it was as if he were unsure of what to say. The applause had begun to swell again, rising louder and more heartfelt, echoing through the hall. People were standing now, clapping, some cheering, some wiping tears from their eyes. The moment was electric, filled with emotion, and the pianist knew he could not remain distant. When he finally reached the stage, he hesitated, glancing at the woman with a mixture of apology and respect. She met his gaze, not with anger or pride, but with calm acknowledgement. There was no need for words to explain what had happened. The music had already spoken for both of them, bridging the gap between judgment and understanding. He began, his voice slightly unsteady. I was wrong. I judged you before I even listened, and I have nothing to say except that your playing was extraordinary. The woman simply nodded, a faint smile gracing her lips. She did not need to accept his apology aloud. The acknowledgment in her eyes was enough. Her performance had spoken louder than any words could, and now, in this moment, it seemed to have changed not only the audience but also the man, who had doubted her. Most people in the audience continued to applaud. Some whistling, some calling out in admiration. But amid the clamor there was a sense of shared understanding, a feeling that something rare and meaningful had taken place. This wasn't just a performance. It was a revelation, a reminder that talent and beauty often lie where we least expect them, and that pride and arrogance can crumble in the face of genuine skill and heart. The famous pianist, still standing near the stage, looked around the hall. He could see the faces of people moved to tears, the expressions of those astonished and delighted by what they had witnessed, and then he returned his gaze to her. In that moment he understood something fundamental. It wasn't about being the best or the most famous. It was about truth, expression, and connection. She had touched everyone in that room because she had played from her heart, not from her ego. Slowly she stood and stepped back from the piano, the finality of the performance settling over her. The applause swelled once more, stronger than ever, and the audience gave her a standing ovation. She bowed slightly, acknowledging the admiration without pride, and it was clear that she had not played to impress or dominate. She had played because she needed to, because the music was a part of her. And because she had something to say that went beyond words. The famous pianist took a deep breath. His own applause joining the rest, but quieter, more introspective. He realized he had been humbled, not just by her skill, but by her courage, her humility, and her honesty. For all his years of performance and recognition, he had never truly understood the power of music in this way. Watching her play had reminded him that the heart of music is not in perfection, but in the ability to move others, to awaken something inside them that cannot be measured by accolades or certificates. After a few moments, the host of the event stepped forward, applauding along with everyone else. That, he said, his voice full of admiration, was one of the most beautiful performances I have ever heard. Thank you for sharing your talent with us tonight. The woman smiled softly, acknowledging the host and the audience with gentle grace. She didn't need any further praise. The applause itself, the reaction of the crowd, and the knowledge that she had expressed herself fully were enough. She had returned to the piano after so many years, unsure of herself, and now she knew that the music still lived within her. The famous pianist, still standing, finally found his voice. You've reminded me, he said, addressing the room as well as her, that music is not about pride or recognition. It is about honesty, emotion, and connection. Tonight you have taught me more than I could have imagined. There was a quiet weight to his words, a sincerity that was unusual for someone so accustomed to admiration and applause. The audience sensed it, and they responded with renewed applause, not just for her, but for the rare moment of humility and respect they had witnessed. It was a rare combination, a meeting of talent, emotion, and understanding, and it left a lasting impression on everyone present. She turned away from the piano at last, stepping down from the stage with quiet confidence. She didn't rush or linger for attention. The applause continued, and she allowed it, but her focus was elsewhere, inward, on the satisfaction of having expressed herself fully. She had faced doubt, ridicule, and judgment, and yet she had emerged not only unbroken but stronger, connected to the very essence of what had once made her love music so deeply. The famous pianist approached her once more, now without any trace of arrogance. I apologize, he said simply, his voice steady now. I was wrong to judge you. That was a performance I will never forget. She nodded, accepting the apology without comment. There was no need for words beyond this. The music had already said everything. It had told a story of courage, talent, humility, and the power of self-expression. It had reminded everyone in the room that appearances can be deceiving, that quiet strength often carries more weight than loud confidence, and that true skill comes not from ego, but from heart. People began to approach her, some to offer congratulations, others to express their amazement. She responded with soft smiles, polite nods, and gentle words. The energy in the room was warm, almost electric, and it was clear that this performance would be remembered for years to come. It was not just a memory of music, but a memory of a moment where humility and talent overcame arrogance and doubt. The famous pianist stood slightly apart, observing quietly. He had learned a lesson that night, a lesson about pride, judgment, and the true power of music. For all his skill, he had been humbled by someone he had underestimated. And in that humility, he found a new respect, not just for her, but for the art itself, for the way music could touch hearts in ways he had long forgotten. As the event continued and the audience slowly dispersed, conversations buzzed with excitement. People discussed her performance, her courage, and the depth of feeling she had brought to the music. And though she blended into the crowd quietly, her presence lingered in everyone's mind. The memory of her playing would remain, a testament to the power of talent, humility, and expression. The night ended with smiles, handshakes, and lingering applause. The piano sat quietly on the stage, as if it too were catching its breath after bearing witness to something extraordinary. And somewhere in the crowd, the famous pianist reflected on a lesson he would never forget: that talent is more than skill, and that the human heart responds most to honesty, emotion, and courage. The quiet woman walked out of the hall that night with her head held high, carrying with her not just the memory of the applause, but a renewed sense of purpose. She had faced doubt and judgment and had responded not with defiance, but with the one thing she knew best: music. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone, including the most arrogant observer, that true greatness comes not from pride, but from heart. The echoes of that night, the music, the emotion, and the humility, would stay with everyone present for a long time. And for the quiet woman, it was a reaffirmation of a truth she had always known, that music is not about proving yourself to others, but about expressing the deepest parts of who you are.